The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of courtroom 302 in downtown Atlanta, Georgia. It was 9:15 a.m. on a Wednesday, and Judge William Harrison was already massaging his temples. He had been presiding over traffic court for 15 years, and to him, every case was starting to sound the same. The wooden benches were filled with the usual mix of frustrated citizens, all waiting for their turn to plead their cases. The air conditioning hummed quietly in the background, barely masking the whispered conversations and nervous shuffling of papers. "Next case," Judge Harrison called out, his voice carrying the weight of boredom. He didn't even look up from his papers as the court clerk announced the name. "Case number 2347, Sarah Mitchell, Your Honor." Sarah Mitchell stood up from her seat in the third row. She was 32 years old, dressed in a crisp navy blazer and matching slacks. Her natural hair was styled professionally, and she carried herself with quiet confidence as she approached the podium. In her hands, she held a neat folder containing her documentation. The judge finally glanced up, his eyes barely registering her presence before returning to the citation in front of him. "Miss Mitchell, you're here for running a red light at the intersection of Peachtree and Pine Street on March 15th at 6:45 a.m. How do you plead?" "Your Honor, if I may explain the circumstances," Sarah began, her voice clear and professional. Judge Harrison cut her off with a wave of his hand. "The question is simple, Ms. Mitchell. Guilty or not guilty?" His tone carried an edge of impatience that made several observers in the courtroom shift uncomfortably in their seats. Sarah straightened her shoulders. "Not guilty, Your Honor, but I would like to provide context for the situation." The judge let out an audible sigh, one he had perfected over years of hearing what he assumed would be another excuse. He leaned back in his large leather chair, making it creak slightly. The morning light caught his silver hair, and his black robes seemed to make him more imposing as he looked down from his elevated bench. Officer James Parker, who had issued the citation, stepped forward when called. He was a veteran traffic cop with 20 years on the force. "Your Honor, I observed Ms. Mitchell's vehicle, a black Mercedes, clearly running through a red light. The light had been red for at least 3 seconds when she proceeded through the intersection." Judge Harrison nodded, jotting something down on his notepad. The scratching of his pen seemed unusually loud in the quiet courtroom. He didn't notice how Sarah was carefully pulling out several documents from her folder, or how another person in professional attire had moved to sit closer to the front of the courtroom. "Miss Mitchell," the judge said, still writing, "the officer's statement is quite clear. Do you deny running the red light?" "No, Your Honor, but the circumstances were—" "Miss Mitchell," he interrupted again, finally looking up at her with barely concealed frustration. His glasses sat low on his nose as he peered over them. "In my experience, there are very few circumstances that justify running a red light. This is a matter of public safety." The court clerk, Mrs. Rodriguez, who had seen thousands of cases herself, noticed something different about Sarah. Unlike most defendants who showed nervousness or anger, Sarah maintained a calm, professional demeanor that seemed out of place in traffic court. Judge Harrison picked up his gavel, ready to pronounce his decision. The morning sun had shifted, casting long shadows across his desk. The American flag behind him stood still in the climate-controlled air, its presence a silent witness to the proceedings. "Given the clear nature of this violation," he began, his tone carrying the weight of someone who had already made up his mind, "and considering the potential danger to other motorists." The door at the back of the courtroom opened quietly, and a man in a pilot's uniform slipped in, taking a seat in the last row. Sarah noticed his arrival but kept her attention focused on the judge, who continued speaking without acknowledging the new presence in his courtroom. Judge Harrison's voice grew stern as he continued. "I'm going to impose a fine of $500, which is at the higher end of the scale given the blatant nature of this violation." He began reaching for his gavel to make it official, not noticing how Sarah was now holding up a particular identification card, waiting for her chance to speak. The morning was about to take an unexpected turn, and Judge William Harrison had no idea that his next few minutes would change his perspective forever. Sarah Mitchell stood perfectly still at the podium, her hands still raised slightly as she tried once again to speak. The morning light streaming through the courthouse windows caught the gold band of her watch, a graduation gift she had received after completing flight school. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady despite the growing frustration in her chest, "I have documentation that—" Judge Harrison raised his hand dismissively, cutting her off for the third time. Ms. Mitchell, I've heard every excuse possible in my 15 years on this bench. He shuffled some papers on his desk, not bothering to look at the documents she was trying to present. Running a red light is running a red light. The courtroom had grown unusually quiet. Even the usual rustling of papers and whispered conversations had ceased. The other defendants waiting their turn watched the scene unfold with growing interest. Many of them had noticed the obvious difference in how the judge was treating this case compared to the previous ones that morning. Mrs. Rodriguez, the court clerk, frowned slightly as she typed into her computer. She had watched Judge Harrison handle 6 similar cases that morning, all resulting in the standard $150 fine. This was the first time to date he had imposed the maximum penalty of $500. But, Your Honor. Sarah tried again, her professional demeanor remaining intact even as the judge's dismissive attitude became more apparent. She held up her folder, filled with neatly organized documents. If you would just allow me to explain. Ms. Mitchell, Judge Harrison interrupted, his voice carrying a hint of condescension that made several observers wince. The fine is $500. If you cannot pay it today, you can set up a payment plan with the clerk. He began writing on his notepad, clearly considering the matter closed. In the back of the courtroom, the man in the pilot's uniform shifted forward in his seat. Captain James Thompson, Sarah's colleague, checked his watch with growing concern. Their flight was scheduled for takeoff in less than 2 hours, and they needed both pilots in the cockpit. Sarah took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. Her years of training in staying calm under pressure were being put to the test in an unexpected way. Your Honor, with all due respect, you haven't allowed me to present any of my documentation or explain the emergency situation that. Emergency situation? Judge Harrison looked up, his eyebrows raised in what appeared to be skepticism. Ms. Mitchell, unless you were driving an ambulance or a fire truck, there's no emergency that justifies putting other people's lives at risk. The irony of his statement hung in the air, though he remained unaware of it. Sarah glanced back at Captain Thompson, who gave her a subtle nod of encouragement. Officer Parker, who had been standing quietly to the side, stepped forward. Your Honor, if I may add something. That won't be necessary, officer, Judge Harrison said firmly. The violation is clear-cut. He turned his attention back to Sarah, his tone becoming more stern. Ms. Mitchell, your continued attempts to justify your actions only demonstrate a lack of respect for the law and this court. Sarah's hand tightened slightly on her folder, but her voice remained professional. Sir, I am not attempting to disrespect the court. I am merely requesting the same opportunity to present my case that was given to other defendants this morning. A murmur of agreement rippled through the courtroom. Judge Harrison's face reddened slightly as he realized the other defendants had noticed the disparity in treatment. Furthermore, Sarah continued, seizing the moment, I have time-stamped documentation that proves I was responding to an emergency situation that morning, one that involved the safety of over 200 people. This caught Judge Harrison's attention, though his expression remained skeptical. He leaned forward slightly, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. 200 people? Ms. Mitchell, are you expecting this court to believe? Yes, Your Honor, Sarah interrupted firmly, finally managing to get a complete sentence out. She reached into her folder and pulled out her airline ID and pilot's license. Because at 6:45 a.m. that morning, I was being called in as an emergency replacement pilot for Delta Airlines Flight 2387 to Chicago O'Hare. The courtroom fell silent. Judge Harrison's mouth opened slightly, then closed again. For the first time that morning, he found himself at a loss for words as he stared at the credentials Sarah was now holding up for the court to see. The silence in courtroom 302 seemed to stretch for an eternity. Judge Harrison's eyes moved slowly between Sarah's confident face and the gold wings pinned to her airline ID badge. His reading glasses slipped slightly down his nose as he leaned forward for a better look. You're a commercial airline pilot? He asked, his previous dismissive tone replaced by genuine surprise. Sarah nodded professionally. Yes, Your Honor. I'm a senior first officer with Delta Airlines, certified on the Boeing 737 and Airbus A320 aircraft. She began laying out her documentation on the podium. I have logged over 5,000 flight hours and have been with the airline for 7 years. Captain James Thompson chose this moment to stand up from his seat in the back. His uniform caught the morning light as he walked forward, his captain's stripes clearly visible on his shoulders. Your Honor, if I may approach? Judge Harrison nodded numbly, still processing this unexpected turn of events. The entire courtroom watched as Captain Thompson made his way to stand beside Sarah. I'm Captain James Thompson, he introduced himself, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to commanding aircraft. I was scheduled to pilot Flight 2387 that morning. Our original first officer called in sick just 2 hours before departure. With 237 passengers already checked in, we needed an immediate replacement. Sarah continued the explanation, her voice steady and professional. I received the emergency call at 6:30 a.m. The flight was scheduled for 8:00 a.m., and without a complete flight crew, we would have had to cancel, stranding hundreds of passengers. Mrs. Rodriguez, the court clerk, had stopped typing to watch the scene unfold. She noticed how Judge Harrison's face had lost its previous stern expression, replaced by something that looked remarkably like embarrassment. These are the flight logs from that morning, Sarah said, presenting more documents. They show the original crew assignment, the emergency notification, and my acceptance of the replacement position. The red light incident occurred while I was responding to this emergency call. Officer Parker, who had issued the citation, stepped forward again. Your Honor, if I may add something now. When the judge nodded, he continued, Ms. Mitchell was extremely professional when I pulled her over. She tried to explain about the flight, but I had to keep the traffic stop brief due to other incidents occurring. Sarah pulled out one final document. I also have here a letter from Delta Airlines chief pilot, confirming that my presence that morning was crucial. Thanks to my quick response, Flight 2387 departed only 15 minutes behind schedule, maintaining our on-time performance record and ensuring minimal disruption to our passengers' travel plans. The sunlight streaming through the courthouse windows had shifted, now illuminating Sarah's face as she stood straight and composed. The other defendants in the courtroom were watching with a mixture of admiration and satisfaction. Judge Harrison removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. When he looked up again, he seemed to be seeing Sarah properly for the first time. Ms. Mitchell, how long have you been a pilot? I earned my private pilot's license at age 19, Your Honor, Sarah replied. I worked as a flight instructor while completing my commercial certifications. I was hired by Delta at age 25, making me one of their youngest pilots at the time. Captain Thompson added, Sarah is one of our most reliable pilots. She's known for her excellent judgment and quick thinking in emergency situations. That morning, she was responding to exactly the kind of situation we trained for, putting passenger safety and operational necessity first. The judge looked down at his earlier notes, where he had written his harsh fine amount. The paper seemed to mock him now. In the gallery, several people were nodding in approval at Sarah's explanation. Your Honor, Sarah said, her voice softer but still professional, I understand the seriousness of running a red light. Safety is quite literally my profession. That morning, I had to make a quick decision between two less than ideal options. I checked carefully that the intersection was clear before proceeding. Judge Harrison set his glasses down on his desk, the morning light reflecting off their lenses. The American flag behind him shifted slightly in the air conditioning breeze, as if it too was paying attention to this unexpected turn of events. The judge cleared his throat, clearly preparing to speak. The entire courtroom leaned forward slightly, waiting to hear how he would handle this revelation. His next words would reveal not just his decision about the traffic violation, but also his character as a judge. Judge William Harrison's leather chair creaked as he leaned back, taking in the full weight of the situation before him. The morning light that had seemed so ordinary earlier now felt uncomfortably bright, almost like a spotlight on his previous behavior. Miss Mitchell, he began, his voice notably different from his earlier tone, would you please share with the court your current role at Delta Airlines? The question was genuine this time, free from the dismissive attitude he had shown earlier. Sarah nodded, standing even straighter if that was possible. I'm currently a senior first officer, Your Honor. I serve as second in command on both domestic and international flights. Last year alone, I was responsible for the safe transport of over 100,000 passengers. The judge picked up her pilot's license again, studying it more carefully this time. His hands trembled slightly as he noted her numerous certifications and ratings. The courtroom remained silent, watching as realization continued to dawn on his face. "And these flight hours," he said, pointing to a number on her documentation, 5,000 plus. That's considered significant. Captain Thompson stepped forward again. "Your Honor, if I may, Sarah is among the top 2% of pilots in terms of flight hours for her age group. She's also an instructor for new pilots and has received 3 safety commendations from the airline." Mrs. Rodriguez, who had worked in this courtroom for over 2 decades, couldn't help but notice how Judge Harrison's face had turned a shade redder. She had seen him make mistakes before, but never had she witnessed him looking quite so humbled. "I see here," the judge continued, shuffling through the papers Sarah had provided, "that you also hold an aircraft mechanic's license." "Yes, Your Honor," Sarah replied. "I believed it was important to understand every aspect of the aircraft I fly. I completed my mechanic's certification while working as a flight instructor." The morning sun caught the gold wings on her pilot's ID as she stood at the podium. Several people in the gallery had pulled out their phones, though court rules prevented them from taking pictures. This was the kind of moment they wanted to remember. Judge Harrison removed his glasses again, this time placing them carefully on his desk. He looked directly at Sarah, his expression having transformed from one of authority to one of genuine respect mixed with embarrassment. "Ms. Mitchell, I owe you an apology," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the courtroom. "I made assumptions, incorrect assumptions, and I failed to give you the proper opportunity to present your case." The other defendants in the courtroom exchanged knowing looks. Officer Parker shifted his weight from one foot to the other, looking somewhat uncomfortable as he recalled his own quick judgment at the traffic stop. "Your record is exemplary," Judge Harrison continued, reviewing more of her documentation. "Not just your driving record, which I see here has been perfect until this incident, but your professional achievements as well." He paused, looking at the harsh fine he had written down earlier. The paper seemed to stare back at him accusingly. The sound of the air conditioning seemed louder in the quiet courtroom as everyone waited for his next words. "I've been on this bench for 15 years, he said, his voice taking on a reflective tone. "And in that time, I've prided myself on being fair and impartial. Today, I failed to live up to that standard." Sarah remained professional, but her shoulders relaxed slightly at the judge's words. Captain Thompson stood supportively beside her, checking his watch discreetly. They still had a flight to prepare for. Judge Harrison picked up his pen, then set it down again. He seemed to be struggling with something internal, something beyond just this traffic case. The morning light had shifted again, casting long shadows across his bench. "Your Honor," Sarah said gently, "I understand you have a difficult job. Making quick decisions is something I do every day in the cockpit. Sometimes, we need to take a moment to gather all the information before proceeding." The irony of her words wasn't lost on anyone in the courtroom. Here was a young black woman teaching a subtle but powerful lesson about judgment and decision-making to a judge who had been so quick to dismiss her. Judge Harrison nodded slowly, picking up his pen once more. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see how he would handle this moment of truth. His next decision would reveal not just the outcome of a traffic ticket, but the measure of his character as both a judge and a human being. Judge Harrison took a deep breath as he studied Sarah's credentials more carefully. His eyes widened as he noticed details he had missed in his initial cursory glance. There, printed on official Delta Airlines letterhead, was a list of her achievements that made his previous assumptions seem even more embarrassing. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, his voice carrying a new tone of respect, "I see here that you were nominated for Delta's Pilot of the Year award in 2023. Sarah nodded modestly. "Yes, Your Honor. It was for successfully handling an emergency landing situation in difficult weather conditions. We had 186 passengers on board that day." The courtroom audience leaned forward, suddenly more interested in this revelation. Mrs. Rodriguez, the court clerk, had stopped typing entirely, her fingers hovering over the keyboard as she listened intently. "And this certification," Judge Harrison continued, holding up another document, "for advanced flight safety training at NASA's facilities?" "That's correct," Sarah replied. "I was one of 12 pilots selected nationwide for the program. We studied advanced emergency procedures and weather pattern analysis. Her voice remained professionally modest, but there was no hiding the accomplishment. Captain Thompson stepped forward again. Your Honor, if I may add, Sarah is also our lead instructor for new pilot training on the Airbus A320. She's responsible for certifying pilots on one of the most advanced commercial aircraft in our fleet. Judge Harrison's face showed a mix of emotions as he processed each new piece of information. The morning sunlight streaming through the courthouse windows seemed to highlight the growing collection of achievements spread across his bench. I see here, he said, picking up another document, that you've also done humanitarian work. His voice carried genuine curiosity now, all traces of his earlier dismissiveness gone. Sarah's expression softened slightly. Yes, Your Honor, I volunteer with Wings of Hope, flying medical supplies to remote areas. Last year, I completed 15 missions to underserved communities. The other defendants in the courtroom, who had been frustrated with their own cases moments ago, now sat in respectful silence. Many were nodding in appreciation of Sarah's accomplishments. Officer Parker, still standing to the side, cleared his throat. Your Honor, I'd like to add something to the record. When the judge nodded, he continued, during the traffic stop, Ms. Mitchell maintained exceptional professionalism. She tried to explain about the emergency flight situation, but I was also too quick to make assumptions. The admission hung in the air, adding another layer to the morning's lessons about prejudgment and bias. The American flag behind the judge's bench seemed to wave gently in the air conditioning breeze, as if acknowledging the moment. Judge Harrison picked up Sarah's pilot's license once more, this time holding it where the whole courtroom could see. Ms. Mitchell, this license, it represents years of dedication, thousands of hours of study, and an unwavering commitment to safety. Is that correct? Yes, Your Honor, Sarah replied. It represents not just technical skills, but also judgment, responsibility, and the trust of thousands of passengers who rely on us every day. The judge nodded slowly, letting her words sink in. He glanced at the gallery, where several observers were watching with intense interest. Some were taking notes, perhaps realizing they were witnessing something more significant than a routine traffic court session. Mrs. Rodriguez quietly pulled out Sarah's original case file, noting how the judge's initial harsh fine now seemed completely out of place given everything they had learned. Your record shows, Judge Harrison continued, his voice thoughtful, that you've never had any safety violations in your flying career. Not a single incident report in 7 years of commercial flying. Safety is paramount in aviation, Your Honor, Sarah responded. Every decision we make, whether in the air or on the ground, must prioritize the well-being of others. The irony of her running a red light while rushing to ensure the safety of hundreds of passengers wasn't lost on anyone in the courtroom. The situation had layers of complexity that Judge Harrison was only now fully appreciating. Captain Thompson checked his watch again, but remained silent, allowing this important moment to unfold. The morning light had shifted, casting a warm glow across the courtroom as Judge Harrison prepared to speak again, his demeanor completely transformed from the beginning of the session. The entire courtroom waited, knowing they were witnessing not just the resolution of a traffic violation, but a profound moment of recognition and learning that would likely stay with everyone present for years to come. Judge Harrison gently placed Sarah's credentials back on his desk. The morning sunlight caught the official seal on her pilot's license, making it glimmer as he took off his glasses and looked directly at her. Ms. Mitchell, he began, his voice carrying a weight of sincerity that hadn't been there before, I owe you more than just a simple apology. I failed in my duty as a judge this morning. The courtroom remained silent as he continued, each person aware they were witnessing an unusual moment in judicial proceedings. Even the usual shuffling of papers had ceased. A judge's primary responsibility, he continued, leaning forward slightly, is to listen and evaluate each case with fairness and impartiality. Today, I did neither. I allowed preconceptions to cloud my judgment, and worse, I repeatedly interrupted your attempts to present valid evidence. Sarah stood quietly at the podium, maintaining her professional composure. Captain Thompson remained beside her, a supportive presence in his crisp pilot's uniform. The fine I initially proposed, Judge Harrison said, picking up his earlier notation and holding it up, was not only excessive, I was influenced by biases I didn't even realize I was carrying. He deliberately tore the paper in half, the sound sharp in the quiet courtroom. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had seen thousands of cases in this courtroom, quickly wiped a tear from her eye. In 15 years, she had never seen Judge Harrison admit to a mistake so openly. "Your Honor," Sarah responded graciously, "we all carry unconscious biases. In aviation, we're trained to recognize and overcome them because they can affect safety. That's why we have checklists and procedures, to ensure we make decisions based on facts, not assumptions." The judge nodded thoughtfully at her words. "Today, you taught this court a valuable lesson, Ms. Mitchell, one that goes far beyond a simple traffic violation." He straightened in his chair, his judicial robe settling around him as he prepared to make his official statement. The morning light streamed through the windows, illuminating the scene as if nature itself wanted to highlight this moment. "Let the record show," he announced formally, "that I am dismissing the traffic citation issued to Sarah Mitchell on March 15th. He paused, then added, "Furthermore, I want to officially apologize to Ms. Mitchell for my unprofessional conduct and biased handling of this case." Officer Parker stepped forward. "Your Honor, I'd also like to apologize for my part in this. I should have noted the emergency situation in my citation report." The other defendants in the courtroom watched with interest as the judge continued. "Ms. Mitchell demonstrated today not only her professional achievements, but also extraordinary grace under pressure, a quality I'm sure serves her well as an airline pilot." Sarah nodded respectfully. "Thank you, Your Honor. I appreciate your willingness to reconsider the case and listen to the full context." Judge Harrison wasn't finished. "I would also like to commend you, Ms. Mitchell, for maintaining your professionalism despite my initial dismissive attitude. Your composed response to unfair treatment speaks volumes about your character." The air in the courtroom felt lighter somehow, as if a heavy weight had been lifted. Several observers nodded in approval, some even smiled. "Mrs. Rodriguez," the judge addressed his clerk, "please ensure that Ms. Mitchell's record reflects that this citation was dismissed with prejudice, and please note in the court record my official apology." The clerk nodded, typing quickly into her computer, her fingers moving with purpose as she documented this unusual turn of events. "Ms. Mitchell," Judge Harrison said, his voice softer now, "you have a flight to prepare for, and I've already taken too much of your valuable time. You're free to go, with this court's sincere apologies and admiration." As Sarah gathered her documents, the judge added one final comment, "And Ms. Mitchell, thank you, not just for your service as a pilot, but for teaching this court a valuable lesson today. Sometimes those who come before us turn out to be our best teachers." Captain Thompson checked his watch and smiled. They still had time to make their pre-flight preparations. Sarah tucked her credentials back into her folder, her movements precise and professional to the end. The morning sun had shifted again, casting long rays across the courtroom floor as Sarah and Captain Thompson prepared to leave. Judge Harrison watched them go, knowing that this morning's session would stay with him for the rest of his career, a powerful reminder about the importance of looking past first impressions and personal biases. News of what happened in courtroom 302 spread through the Atlanta courthouse like wildfire. By lunchtime, the story of the pilot and the judge had reached every floor of the building, from the basement cafeteria to the top-floor offices. Mrs. Rodriguez found herself retelling the story to a group of curious courthouse employees during her lunch break. "You should have seen the judge's face when she pulled out the pilot's license," she said, stirring her coffee. "It was like watching someone completely transform in front of your eyes." In his chambers, Judge Harrison sat quietly at his desk, reviewing the morning's events. The afternoon sun had replaced the morning light, casting different shadows across the legal books that lined his walls. He pulled out his daily docket and began reading through the remaining cases with new eyes. "Your next case is ready, Judge Harrison," his bailiff announced, poking his head through the door. "Thank you, John," the judge replied, then added, "Would you mind sitting in on the afternoon session? I'd appreciate your feedback on my interactions with the defendants." The bailiff nodded, understanding the significance of the request. In 15 years, Judge Harrison had never asked for feedback on his courtroom demeanor. Meanwhile, at Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport, Sarah and Captain Thompson were preparing for their flight to Chicago. As they walked through the terminal, Several airport staff members who had heard about the morning's events gave them knowing looks and smiles. "You handled that situation beautifully," Captain Thompson said as they entered the pilot's briefing room. "Most people would have lost their cool." Sarah smiled slightly as she reviewed the flight plan. Sometimes the best response to prejudice is to remain professional and let your achievements speak for themselves. Back at the courthouse, a young law clerk was furiously typing notes about the morning's events. She had been in the gallery during Sarah's case, and now she was preparing a summary for her law professor. "The impact of implicit bias in traffic court, a case study," she typed at the top of her document. By mid-afternoon, local legal blogs had picked up the story. One prominent legal commentator wrote, "Today's events in Atlanta traffic court serve as a powerful reminder that justice requires more than just following procedures. It requires checking our assumptions at the door." Judge Harrison's colleague, Judge Maria Ramirez, stopped by his chambers during the afternoon recess. "I heard about what happened this morning, Bill," she said gently. "It takes courage to admit mistakes from the bench." He nodded, running a hand through his silver hair. "I've been thinking about how many other times I might have rushed to judgment without realizing it. How many other Sarah Mitchells have stood before me?" In the courthouse security office, Officer Parker was sharing the story with his fellow officers during shift change. "It was a wake-up call," he admitted to his colleagues. "Made me think about how quickly we make assumptions during traffic stops." By the end of the day, the courthouse staff had begun implementing small but significant changes. The clerk's office added a new procedure allowing defendants more time to present documentation before judges made their rulings. The court administrator scheduled a sensitivity training session for the following month. Sarah's story had sparked something larger than just a dismissed traffic ticket. It had initiated conversations about bias and fairness throughout the judicial system, from the security desk to the judge's chambers. As the afternoon sun began to set, Mrs. Rodriguez was finishing up her daily court records. She paused at Sarah's case file, adding one final note. "Case dismissed with prejudice. Judge's official apology entered into record. Defendant's professional credentials and character noted as exemplary." In the skies above Chicago, Sarah was safely piloting her flight, unaware of the impact her morning court appearance had created. She focused on her instruments, checked her altitude, and communicated with air traffic control, demonstrating the same precision and professionalism she had shown in court. Judge Harrison stayed late that evening, reviewing his past cases from the previous month. On his desk lay a new notepad with a simple reminder written at the top. "Listen first. Judge second." The courthouse was almost empty now, the halls quiet except for the sound of the cleaning crew. But the conversation sparked by that morning's events continued in homes and offices across Atlanta. A simple traffic court case had transformed into a powerful lesson about assumptions, dignity, and the constant need to check our biases. As night fell over Atlanta, the story was still spreading, touching more lives and prompting more discussions. Sometimes the most powerful changes start in the most unexpected places, even in traffic court 302 on an ordinary Wednesday morning. 3 months after the memorable morning in traffic court 302, Sarah Mitchell stood at a podium in the main conference hall of the Atlanta Judicial Center. The room was filled with judges, lawyers, and court administrators attending the annual Georgia Judicial Conference. "When I walked into traffic court that morning," Sarah began, addressing the packed room, "I wasn't planning to spark a conversation about bias in our justice system. I was simply trying to explain why I needed to get to the airport quickly." Judge Harrison sat in the front row, nodding as he listened. He looked different now, more approachable, with a softer expression than he had worn that morning in court. Next to him sat Mrs. Rodriguez, who had taken a special day off to attend this session. "Since that day," Sarah continued, "I've received hundreds of messages from people sharing similar experiences. But what makes this story different is what happened afterward." She glanced at Judge Harrison with respect. "It's about how one person's willingness to acknowledge their bias can create real change." The conference room was silent as Sarah shared statistics from the past 3 months. Traffic Court 302 had implemented new procedures requiring judges to review all documentation before making decisions. The results were telling. Appeals had dropped by 40%, and defendant satisfaction ratings had improved significantly. Judge Harrison stood up when it was his turn to speak. "That morning changed more than just one case," he said. his voice carrying across the quiet room. It changed how I approach every case. Now, I see each person who stands before me as someone with a story that deserves to be heard. He shared how his courtroom had become a model for other judges. The Harrison Protocol, as other courts have begun calling it, required judges to ask specific questions about a defendant's circumstances before making any decisions. In the audience, Officer Parker sat in his uniform, representing the Atlanta Police Department. His precinct had adopted new training procedures for traffic stops, emphasizing the importance of allowing drivers to fully explain their situations before issuing citations. The changes we've seen aren't just about procedures, Sarah explained, showing slides of the new initiatives. They're about creating a justice system that truly sees each person who walks through its doors. She clicked to the next slide, showing a picture of her in the cockpit. In aviation, we have a saying, check your instruments, not your assumptions. The same principle applies to justice. We need to check the facts, not our preconceptions. The presentation concluded with an announcement that made the room burst into applause. The Georgia State Bar had created a new annual award, the Mitchell Grant for Judicial Innovation, dedicated to funding initiatives that promote fairness and reduce bias in the court system. After the conference, Sarah returned to her regular duties at Delta Airlines, but her impact continued to ripple through the judicial system. Judge Harrison's courtroom had become a frequent stop for law students studying best practices in judicial conduct. Mrs. Rodriguez proudly displayed a new sign in the clerk's office. Every case has a story. Every story deserves to be heard. It served as a daily reminder to everyone who worked in the courthouse. 6 months after that memorable morning, Sarah received a special letter. It was from a young black girl who had attended the judicial conference with her mother, a court reporter. The girl wrote that seeing Sarah speak had inspired her to pursue both law and aviation, because you showed me that we can break barriers and change minds at the same time. Judge Harrison had also made permanent changes to his courtroom procedures. Every morning, before starting his session, he would look at a small framed photo on his bench. It showed a Delta Airlines plane taking off into the sunrise. It reminded him to approach each case with an open mind and to listen before judging. The story even made its way into judicial training materials across the country. Law professors used it to teach future judges about the importance of checking their biases and giving every person their fair day in court. As Sarah flew her regular routes across the country, she often thought about how one morning in traffic court had created such lasting change. It proved that sometimes the most powerful lessons come from unexpected places, even from a rushed morning, a traffic ticket, and a judge who was willing to learn and grow. The case of the pilot and the judge became more than just an interesting story. It became a catalyst for real change in how justice was administered, one courtroom at a time. And somewhere in Atlanta, in courtroom 302, a sign now hung behind the judge's bench, reading, "Justice sees the person, not just the case."